Good morning and welcome to the Daily Aus. It's Thursday the 19th of March. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Zara Seidler.
A 1999 tax discount designed to get Australians investing is now being blamed for locking young people out of the housing market. Nearly 2 decades later, the government that introduced it is long gone, and the one now in power is eyeing to change it. Another big tax change that's already been confirmed is going to reshape how the wealthiest Australians are taxed on their super. So today, we are going to unpack everything you need to know about Labor's moves to tax the wealthy in the deep dive.
I want to talk all things tax, said nobody ever, but it is me today. Before that, though, thank you to everyone who has already filled out our podcast survey. We've had hundreds and hundreds of responses. It is so helpful for us. We spent the morning just looking through everything, trying to understand what we can do better and what's really working. If you want to make your voice heard, you can head to today's show notes and fill out that survey. Thanks in advance.
We love data.
We love data. And I'm going to make a really messy segue from data to tax, I guess, because there are a couple of conversations in the news cycle at the moment about taxing certain Australians. And one is about capital gains tax and one is about superannuation.
Yep.
Let's start with superannuation first, kind of hit it one by one.
Yep.
What do we need to know about super?
Okay, so off the top, Australia's retirement savings system is called superannuation, super. That means that employers are legally required to contribute 12% of your salary into a super account that is invested and ideally grows and grows and grows over time until you retire with a very healthy nest egg to see out the rest of your life. When your super fund makes money, say by investing in shares that go up in value, the government takes a cut of that increase. So right now, that cut is 15 cents in every dollar, 15%.
Okay, so they're currently taking 15% of the money that's going into super.
The money that's made from your super
So the
balance.
profits.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, cool. And so what is changing then?
So for the very richest Australians, the cut the government takes off those earnings is changing.
Can I just butt in here? When you say the very richest, you're talking about the people who are contributing the most amount to their superannuation. Is that right?
I'm talking about the Australians that have a super balance of $3 million or more,
Okay.
which is less than 1% of Australians with a super account.
Okay.
So back in 2023, the government actually tried to legislate this, but ran into some hurdles. It said at the time, if your total super balance exceeded $3 million, that the tax rate on earnings above that threshold would double. So from 15%, as I mentioned, to 30%. Now, the argument there was that the government was missing out on potential billions in revenue from taxing the wealthiest.
Should we just make clear what that means? So that revenue that is then going to the government can then be spent on whatever.
Yeah,
they
projects,
spend on,
infrastructure.
But taxes are the biggest way that the government does, generate this money. So this was one avenue that they were saying was not being fully realised.
Exactly. And the government basically said that the top 1% could afford to spend more on their super tax and that would have massive benefits or implications for the revenue income overall that the government receives from taxes.
Okay. And so it's been a few years since that plan was first announced. I remember when we covered it, my brain was mildly exploding trying to comprehend it.
Yeah.
But it's obviously back in the news cycle and we are talking about it today. Why is that?
So that proposal ran into a few problems. I want to take you through those because they're really important to understand the super reforms that have been legislated now. So the first big problem was what's called taxing unrealized gains. Now, bear with me. I've made some very real examples for us non-maths gifted people.
You know me too well.
So Zara, imagine you have a Pokemon card worth...
I'm already lost. Yep.
Imagine you know someone who has a Pokemon card worth $10.
Yeah.
They one day find out from someone that that's actually now worth $20. They haven't sold it. It's sitting in a drawer at their mum's house. But it's an unrealized gain, that extra $10 that they could make on the card. So because you haven't actually made any tangible cash from it, but in future could.
Understood.
Now, your super fund works the same way. So it owns things like shares in companies, which can go up in value. But if the fund hasn't sold them, no actual money has come in. So this value versus tangible cash. Now, under the original super tax reform proposal in 2023, the government would still want its cut of that increase.
Even though that increase hadn't been realised yet, or that
Yes.
money wasn't actually in anyone's account.
Yeah, exactly. And critics said that that was unfair because basically to pay that tax bill, some people might have had to sell assets that they weren't ready to.
I understand. And so that was one issue. What was another issue?
So the second problem was that the $3 million threshold I mentioned wasn't going to move with inflation. Now, as I said, less than 1% of Australians have a super balance that's over $3 million, but over time, without moving with inflation, that $3 million figure could end up catching ordinary Australians. So more and more people would be impacted by this, and that's not kind of in the spirit of what the legislation was trying to achieve.
Okay, so critics said, A, you could be taxing gains that haven't been realised, and B, because of inflation, more people could be caught up in these laws than perhaps originally intended.
Exactly.
That criticism was levelled quite loudly. I remember we covered at the time. What has the government said in response to this?
So they've taken all that criticism on board. They've gone away and they've come back with a new proposal that was announced by Treasurer Jim Chalmers, which has 3 major changes. First, the unrealised gains issue is gone, so people will only pay more tax on actual earnings. Secondly, the thresholds will now move with inflation. So the same small portion of the wealthiest Australians will be affected over time without disproportionately affecting ordinary Aussies. And the third is that there are now 2 tiers. So balances between $3 million and $10 million will have earnings taxed at 30%. But anything above $10 million will be taxed at a higher level at 40%. So that is new. Around 80 to 90,000 Australians will be impacted by that first tier and only around 8,000 by that second 40% tier.
Okay, so we're not talking huge numbers here.
Exactly.
But it has dominated quite a lot of political discussion, so it's very interesting to unpack. Those were and are the super changes that have passed Parliament, but there's also been a separate conversation. We covered this in this week's finance newsletter, which if you're not subscribed to, you should. We'll throw a link in today's show notes. But we spoke about capital gains tax, which I know can feel like quite a daunting topic because it's very confusing. What do we need to know about that, about CGT?
Okay, so I want to flag up front that the change that we're going to discuss hasn't actually been confirmed. So a Senate committee handed down a significant report this week. The Treasurer hasn't ruled out on acting on it in the May budget, and a lot of reporting implies that Chalmers will act on it in the upcoming budget, but we're drawing on that report and reporting on other outlets and sources inside government. But until Chalmers confirms anything, treat this as strongly signalled, not a 100% sure thing.
Hey guys, this is my friend Rosa. Say hi, Rosa.
Hi, Rosa.
She's cooking up the deep dive video that you're watching right now. Rosa, what do you want them to do?
Subscribe.
You heard the woman. Now back to the video.
And this was, and I know we haven't actually spoken about what was in it yet, but this was led by a Greens member who chaired that.
Yes.
And there were both Liberal and Labor members on that committee. So it's, I believe the Liberal Party did hand down a dissenting report, so they disagreed with it.
Yes.
But I mean, the idea is that people from across this political spectrum have thought about this.
Yeah, the majority of the committee
Yeah.
sided with the final report, which
Yeah.
we will get into shortly. But in terms of what you need to know about the capital gains tax discount, bear with me. Let's say you buy a house for $1,000. Completely unrealistic.
Find me that in Sydney.
But in the name of simple maths,
Yeah.
bear with me and pretend that you can indeed buy a house for $1,000.
I like this game.
You sell it later for $2,000.
Yep.
You've made a $1,000 profit. That is called a capital gain. Now, if you owned that house for at least 12 months before selling it, you get what's known as the capital gains tax discount. For most Australian residents, that discount is 50%. Now, that doesn't mean you pay 50% tax. It means that only half your profit is counted towards your tax bill.
So the profit is what we're focusing on here. And because there's a discount, only half of it under this discount is being taxed.
Yeah. So $1,000 profit, only $500 of it is taxed.
Yeah.
Now, if you're in the top income tax bracket, where the government takes 45 cents for every dollar you earn, you would pay 45% on $500, not $1,000. So quick maths, that's about $200-ish. 10% of the wealthiest Australians actually receive about 80% of the tax benefits from that concession. So it's a significant saving that is mostly being taken up by the highest earners in Australia.
Yeah.
And it should be noted that this tax discount doesn't just apply to property, it can be applied on assets, shares, but it is the property angle that has drawn the most attention.
What are the origins of this discount? What was it intended to do?
This is actually from the Howard government. So Prime Minister John Howard introduced in 1999 this 50% capital gains tax discount, basically to encourage more Australians to invest and to invest in real estate and other areas, as I mentioned. Now, at the time, the argument was that without this discount, the tax hit from selling an asset basically meant it wouldn't be worth it, that it wouldn't be worth it for investors in the first place to try to invest.
Gotcha.
And
Okay.
those in favour of this discount basically make the same argument today. The Property Council of Australia, for instance, argues that reducing the discount won't improve housing affordability, that it will take investors out of the housing market, and it could actually lead to fewer homes being built and higher rents.
Okay, so its intended use was to make it easier to buy and sell homes for investors. What has been the reason that they're now interrogating how that's looking? You said a bit earlier that we are looking at the top tax bracket mostly using this. Is that the concern here?
Yeah, so this Senate committee that we've touched on a little bit, which was chaired by Green Senator Nick McKim, it included Liberal and Labor senators, found that the capital gains tax discount has, together with negative gearing, a separate tax concession for another day, quote, skewed the ownership of housing away from owner-occupiers and towards investors, and flagged that it could be contributing to intergenerational inequality, which we hear so much about when we're talking about property ownership, basically meaning that younger Australians have lost out because of this discount and its favourability to wealthier Australians. But as you did say correctly earlier, Zara, Liberal senators on the committee did disagree with the findings. They called them, quote, simplistic, and argue that housing supply, is the real issue and the real driver of the housing crisis.
Okay, so the Senate committee has made recommendations to the government about changing or removing that CGT discount.
Yes.
We don't know how the government will respond at the time of recording. They haven't responded. We can expect that before the May budget, most likely. One thing I am curious about, and I guess for anyone who remembers the 2019 federal election, there was a lot of talk about capital gains tax and negative gearing, and oftentimes it is chalked up as one of the reasons why Labor lost the election, because they took policies to that election that were deemed unpopular by the Australian public. I am interested why Labor is considering capital gains tax changes now. What's changed?
Well, you're absolutely right. That is the 2019 election loss kind of big conversation point. You can't talk about that loss without talking about those policies. But we're in a very different political landscape. Things have shifted dramatically for the Labor Party and also for the coalition. So Labor won the last election with an historic majority. The opposition's polling, meantime, is at historic lows. So you have this argument being made that Labor now has such a secure runway to secure the next election, according to many political commentators. And that means that they maybe have a bit more confidence or a bit more of a willingness to push through these historically more contentious policy areas because they have such a comprehensive leadership and majority in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, and look, I don't often find myself reading about tax, but I have also seen a lot of headlines. Independent MP Allegra Spender wrote a white paper about tax reform, and I know that there were changes to do with CGT in there. So there's a lot of different pressure points now on the government to do something here.
Yes.
But of course, we knew how unpopular it was back in 2019. So really interesting I guess to see what will happen now. Has the Australian public changed that dramatically? We'll have to wait and see.
And these reforms are not popular with the coalition, it should be noted, but we now have a strong presence of independents. We have the Greens and other minor parties who do support these kinds of reforms and who say that they have been a long time coming.
Yeah, interesting. Now, Em, just to finish up with, what are the next steps when it comes to both of these things? You said the super changes have already been pushed through Parliament, but CGT hasn't. What happens now?
The super reforms will come into effect on the 1st of July. So that's when anyone with a super balance of above $3 million will start being taxed on their earnings at those higher thresholds, 30% or 40%, depending on their balance. On the CGT discount, we are basically waiting and watching for the May budget. So the federal budget handed down in the middle of May, and that will probably give us more information, or, Chalmers may start breadcrumbing, for lack of a better word, the policy there over the coming weeks. Yes, exactly. Shadow Treasurer Ted O'Brien has indicated the coalition won't support any changes to capital gains tax discounts. So the government will need, as we flagged, the Greens or crossbenchers, but there's certainly momentum there. Many of them have been super vocal about wanting exactly this kind of thing.
Yeah, look, and very interesting stuff. And I know it can be complex. So if anyone listening has any questions, you can ask us. If you're on Spotify, there's a Q&A section there. And we'll try to get back to as many of you as possible. But thank you for taking us through that.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Daily Aus. We'll, of course, be back later today with the headlines. But until then, have a great day.